The Resource Reduction Survey is the last of the two primary surveys for your recognition application. In the Surveys tab in GreenBiz Tracker, the Resource Reduction Survey is the second of three surveys associated with the recognition application. It has a total of around 250 points associated with it, so it really focuses on metrics associated with resource use and resource reduction at your organization. So we're focusing on energy, water, waste, and fuel use. In terms of the metrics, something important to recognize is that metrics account for 250 of the 380 some points that are tied to our application. So metrics do make up a massive part of our recognition application and represent a big area that you can get points towards recognition in our applications. That said, getting points in metrics can be really difficult because we're really looking for realized reductions over time in energy, water, waste, and fuel. And that can be hard to achieve if your organization is growing. So there are a couple tips that we have for you here, and it's something to keep in mind that you don't need points in all of these categories for recognition. So the goal, again, is continual improvement. You do what you can, you look at what's next, and you move forward. We're not expecting perfect scores here. We're really meant to be providing points for whatever it is you're able to implement over time. So you can do your best and you can always look for room to improve further. This example is E1, our electricity consumption question. So in this question, as an example, you're going to pick a baseline year. You're going to enter in the total electricity consumption for that baseline year, and then you're going to do the same for your current year. We're also asking you to submit what's called a use intensity variable. This is essentially a number that we divide your electricity use by to get a better understanding for changes over time. And what we want that number to be is something that really directly impacts your energy use. So for an office, as an example, the number of employees that work in office is going to be the biggest thing that impacts the energy use and the water use in that office space. So number of employees might be the best variable there. Conversely, if we're looking at a food and beverage manufacturer like a brewery, the biggest impact to the energy use and water use in that space is probably going to be the amount of beer being produced. So per barrel of beer produced might be the use intensity variable that makes the most sense here. What that really allows us to do is that even if your organization is growing, let's say you produced more beer this year than you did last year, we can still see your overall use intensity, your energy use per barrel. And that gives us a better understanding of the effort that you've put in to trying to reduce the amount of energy you're using to run your operation. As you're moving through this process and you're organizing your metrics for the application, you might be wondering what baseline year you should pick for your application. And that's a great question. The baseline year is really meant to be the first year that you're regularly collecting data for your organization. So if you are, again, a brewery, maybe 2012 was the first time you really started tracking your energy use. So 2012 would be a good baseline year. It also gives you a sense for what business as usual looked like at your organization before you started implementing comprehensive changes to your energy use. So it's a good year to compare the future to say, well, where would we be if we were still doing exactly what we were doing back then? So that's really what you want the baseline year to be, is it's a comparison point to assess all of the reductions that you make from then until now. We really encourage businesses to select whatever baseline year makes the most sense to showcase the change at the organization. One of the most common things we see is that when a business first submits a recognition application, they'll use their most recent completed calendar year as their baseline. So if I'm submitting in 2024, as an example, I might want to use 2023 as my baseline because it's my most recent year. That's fine, but keep in mind that if you do that, 2023 is going to be your baseline and current year data. So you're not going to get any points for changes over time. If you want more points for changes over time, and if you want to be able to tell the story of the effort that you've put into efficiency over the years, you want to go further back in time for your baseline year. And you want to select a baseline that represents when you first started really trying to put effort into efficiency in your operation, because that way we can see that change over time as we look at your use intensity numbers. Let's look at a concrete example of how we use baseline and current year data to assess changes over time. So in this example, we have an organization, a brewery, that is using barrels of beer produced as their use intensity number and has selected 2007 as their baseline year. So in 2007, they produced a certain amount of beer and they have a certain amount of energy use associated with that. When you divide those numbers, you get about 31 kilowatt hours per barrel of beer produced. When we move ahead to the current year, their organization has probably put some time and energy into maybe buying more energy efficient equipment, maybe insulating their heated lines so that they're not losing as much heat in the process of producing the beer, maybe replacing their LED lights, all kinds of things that would reduce their energy use. They've also produced more beer in the current year, 2023, than they did in 2007. So their number overall has gone up. They've gone from about 1.4 million kilowatt hours to 2.4 million kilowatt hours. But that said, they've produced a lot more beer. So when you look at their electric intensity, they've actually gone down. What that means is that if they hadn't made the changes to their operation that they made, and they had achieved the same amount of growth over time, they would be using even more energy in that business as usual case. So what we want is to recognize that business for creating a more efficient beer. They're using less energy per barrel than they would have otherwise. And that's the reduction we're looking for. That's also how use intensity can really help you tell your story if you pick the right number for it. It's kind of the ultimate normalizing factor. It gives you a way to tell the story of the commitment you've made to sustainability, despite variables that might be outside of your control, like changes in size, scope, or space. When we're asking about energy use or water use, we're also giving you points for energy intensity and water intensity. So when you're thinking about these numbers, you really want to think about what's the variable that most impacts the resource use at my organization. When you're thinking about what formula to use, you want to think about something that changes over time as your operation changes so that you can use it for your baseline year and for your current year. Your use intensity variable, meaning the type of variable you're using, whether it's per employees or per pound of product produced, you want that variable to be the same year over year. You want to pick the same type of variable. So if I'm using per employee, I'm going to use the number of employees I had in 2007 as my baseline variable. And then I'm going to use the number of employees I had in 2023 as my current year variable. Again, just to underscore a couple of these tips, you want to use consistent variables between the baseline and the current year. So you're picking the same type of variable year over year. And you want to make sure that you're picking a good baseline that represents the change in your organization and the thing that impacts your resource use the best. If you're an organization that's just getting started on your data tracking and you don't have utility data going back beyond 2023, then you can actually use a lot of utility providers to get that retroactive data on your energy use prior to when you started tracking. So as an example, Excel has a program called their Green Button Connect program that will actually give you 48 months of data. So even if you've not started tracking your data before, you'll still have a baseline that's a couple years old so that you can see that change over time, even if you weren't tracking it back then. And that actually could be a fantastic baseline because if you weren't tracking it, it's truly a business as usual scenario. You didn't make any changes because you didn't know what to make changes on. Once you started tracking your data, you're more likely to have made change because you see the number going up and you want to do something about it. So being able to go back in time and to look at data from before you started really analyzing your energy use is a good way of picking a baseline year. Again, to give you some concrete examples of what this looks like when we're reviewing applications, I wanted to show you a couple of good and bad examples of metrics that we've received in the application and how we're looking at them, so you can get a feel for what this looks like in real time. So the red boxes highlighted are examples of data that wasn't submitted correctly in order to get the maximum number of points available. In this first instance, in 2021, you can see that the organization hasn't submitted baseline data for 2021. They have submitted current year data. But without that baseline data, we have nothing to compare their current year to. And so that business isn't going to get any points for reductions over time. We also have an example of inconsistent variables being used. So here, where we have this 2021 data, we've got a solid baseline listed at 2021, and we've got square footage entered. Then under current year, we don't have any heating data. We do have electricity data, which we might be able to provide some points for. But in their current year metrics, they actually gave us a per employee number, which is 1. So in this case, the per employee number is not the best variable, because if it was 1 before and it's 1 now, it's staying the same, right? And you want a variable that changes as your resource use does. The second piece here is that because we have 2 different variables to use, we actually have no way to compare these numbers. So again, we can't provide points for reductions over time. A good example of data being submitted in a way that gets a business points is this top line. We have a 2019 baseline year selected. We've got our heating data, we've got our total electricity data, and we've got a variable picked, which was per unit of product produced. We calculated the use intensity to be 12.2. Then we have our current year data. Again, complete data has been submitted. We've got our variable. We've got the same type of variable being used, and the number has actually gone up a little bit. So they've increased the amount of product they're producing year over year. And so what that means is that their new calculated use intensity is lower than it was before. So this business is going to get some points for reductions over time, because even if their total energy use has gone up a little bit, they're producing more with that energy. So their efficiency has increased. As a general rule, one of the best things that you can start doing to get yourself in a good position to receive recognition in our program in the years to come is to start tracking your metrics. Tracking your data is a really important step in learning to control and implement practices to increase the efficiency of that data. A phrase we really like to use in the sustainability world is what isn't tracked isn't managed. And if you're not tracking your resource use, it's hard to know what's happening with it. It could be that a pipe has burst and sprung a leak. And if you're not tracking water use, there's not really necessarily a way to know that until it starts impacting operations or until you get a really high bill. If you're tracking your data use through either live feed meters or through manual meter reading, you're going to notice that change over time, and you're more likely to be able to point to it, recognize that it's a significant increase, and take steps to prevent it from happening again in the future. There are a lot of different ways that you can do that, and we have a lot of resources available to help you. So the best way, if you want to get started with this, is just to reach out to us, and we can help you get established with whatever resource works best for you. And that's really it for the recognition application. Once you've submitted the submission agreement, come June 30th, our team pulls the completed applications out of GreenBiz Tracker for scoring. We provide them to our application committee, who reviews all of the questions in the application and assigns point values that can be used to assess the level of recognition that that organization is ready for. We then complete our compliance checks, and we notify our businesses, usually by the end of July or early August, as to what recognition level they've achieved. If you have any questions about this process, you can reach out to our state staff at any time with those questions, and we'll be happy to answer them for you. But that's the layout of the way the application process normally looks year over year.